Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this Insta Live session today. At this time, we're in Belgium. My name is Liesbeth Aerts. I'm a science communicator at VIB and also a volunteer at Infopunt Proefdieronderzoek. And I'll now invite our scientist on the call, which is Charlotte Scott from VIB and UGent. 1 second while we wait for her to join. Yes. So Charlotte Scott is a scientist here in Belgium, but she's not from Belgium originally. So we'll have this conversation in English anyway. She's a group leader at VIB, as I mentioned. She also got an ERC starting grant. So she's a very successful and highly promising young researcher. And I'm sure she'll introduce herself as well while we wait for her to join. There we are. Hi. Hello, Charlotte. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for joining. I just also already introduced you to the viewers already here in this live call. So what I haven't mentioned is that Charlotte is an immunologist. She studies macrophages and dendritic cells, which are favorite cells, I'm guessing. There's two types of immune cells, and she does this particularly because, well, they play a role also in liver disease. But I think the specialist can probably tell it better. So I think my first question to you, Charlotte, today is whether you can tell us a little bit more about your research and also specifically what role animals do play in it.
Yeah, of course. So as you said, we're working on two types of immune cells, macrophages and dendritic cells. And we're really interested in the roles that these cells play in liver disease, particularly in the setting of obesity, but also in things like drug overdose and things like that. And so unfortunately, these cells, they don't work alone. They work in a complex environment. And so the only way we can really study these cells and how they're interacting with their environment is using animal models. And for that, we're using mice models in our research.
Okay. And you're also, I mean, besides a researcher working then with mice, you're also part of the ethical committee of your university, I understand. So yes. Maybe you, I mean, as part of this committee, can tell us a bit more what this committee does exactly, why it's important in sort of the regulation and policy around animal research, and what your role is there as a scientist.
Yeah, of course. So obviously animal research is very tightly regulated. We have to be careful with what we're using, and this is where the ethical committee comes in. So any experimentation that any researcher wants to do has to go through ethical approval to make sure that the mice are being treated fairly, that they don't undergo any unnecessary suffering, and that the numbers of mice that are planned to be used are as small as possible, so that we're not using mice that we don't need to use. And so as a scientist, as part of the ethical committee, my role is to go through all these different applications and assess if they're suitable, if the experiments make sense, if they're using a sufficient number of mice that will allow for results to be obtained, but preventing the unnecessary use of too many animals. And so there's a whole committee of people, and we meet regularly to discuss this and to discuss setting up of standardized protocols and things like that to make sure that the mice routinely are treated fairly and prevent any suffering.
Okay, well, that's great, and that's good to hear that you also are involved in this. So, as you know, today, 1st of July is Be Open About Animal Research Day. So, like yourself, lots of scientists across the globe to talk about animal research and to stress the importance of openness. So, do you think this campaign is important, and do you also communicate openly about your research? Do you think this is difficult, not difficult, necessary or unnecessary? Could you fill us in a little bit on how you talk about it or communicate about it?
So firstly, I think it's really important that we have this discussion. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what animal research is and how the animals are treated, and that's really not the case. we try and communicate it as many ways as possible, doing things like this. I think this is a great initiative, Transparency Thursday, but also, yeah, just through Twitter, through public outreach, when we participate in a lot of scientific outreach events for the public, some of them held by Ghent University, some of them held by VIB, some of them just generally held throughout Belgium. So we just try and participate to all of these and explain what we're doing and why we're doing it, and answer any questions everybody may have.
And what's your experience when you do this? Do you get positive feedback, or is it sometimes challenging, or?
I think it can be challenging, but I think it's usually rewarding. I think people like to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And when they can see a benefit or a reason to do it, then I think it helps with the overall perception of animal research.
Yeah. And you're already an experienced scientist, of course, and maybe there are hopefully some interested members of the public listening, but maybe also some young scientists, some fresh PhD students who want to be open about animal research, but are maybe a little bit intimidated because it is a difficult conversation. So do you, with your experience, also being on the board and the ethical committee and being a scientist, do you have some tips for them on where to start or how to go about it, or maybe what to avoid? Could also be important.
Yeah, I think you can just start at home. You can start with anyone in your local environment that's interested in what you're doing, and then you can explain how it comes about, how you start, how you plan animal experiments, and then from there it can grow sort of spontaneously, and then you get more confidence when you speak to friends and family. You can get more confidence to then go and speak to the general public, and I think like that's also how I got started and how this all came about.
Yeah, and then maybe for the local perspective. So we're here in the Belgian chat, but as I mentioned while introducing you to our audience, you're not originally from Belgium. You also have some experience working abroad in science. So do you see some differences internationally? And also added to that, there's always the language issue, that if you want to talk now to the local public, in Ghent, where you work, that's maybe in Dutch. So is this a hurdle, and are things different in Belgium than elsewhere in your experience?
I have to say, I think it's been changing with time. So I was previously in the UK, and that was about 7 years ago. And I think when I started my PhD in the UK, it was much less talked about. I think now there is much more of an effort to explain what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so I've seen a growth in this, and yeah, I don't know, part of it maybe because there's differences in country, but I think a lot of it is also just related to time and the acknowledgement that we need to talk about this, and then much more initiatives driving this. So I'm not sure if there's really a big difference in the two countries, or if it's just a time thing. But I have to say now it's clearly much more open, and it's much easier to have the discussion now than it was when I first started 15 years ago.
And do you feel supported by your colleagues or like your institute to communicate about this, or are they maybe a bit sometimes like, let's not mention it if we don't need to? Or
no, I think so I'm working at the VIB and also Ghent University. I think the VIB have a lot of initiatives driving being open about animal research. Also Ghent University are doing a lot. I think the idea is that we should promote this and we should discuss it when appropriate. Of course, there are times when you have to monitor what you say or how you say it, but I think overall all of the institutes are really positively pushing towards an open sharing of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Okay, that's great to hear. I think that was a great introduction to hear from you and your experience as a scientist, as an ethical board member, to talk about how you communicate. So I want to thank you very much for your time. I hope it was informative to the listeners, now live and later not watching live. So thanks again. And if you have questions for Charlotte or the situation in Belgium, feel free to reach out to EARA, to me, and we're happy to get in touch. Have a nice day, everyone, and thank you very much, Charlotte.
Thanks, Liesbeth. Bye.
Bye.